Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Meredith Shaw. Now, Meredith is an associate professor at the Institute of Social Science at the University of Tokyo and the managing editor of Social Science Japan Journal. And in the past few years, she has focused her research on the study of North Korean literature, specifically new trends and ideas that come about through this new Kim Jong-un era internal propaganda. And of course, the study of North Korean literature in a society that is so closeted offers an important insight into how the regime sees itself, its relationship with its citizens, and the differences and discrepancies between how it communicates with the outside world and how it deliberately communicates internally. This is an insight into North Korean ideology, the North Korean mind. And strangely, this is an area of study that is often overlooked within mainstream academia. But it is hard to get away from the fact that there is no more important thing to understand about North Korea and its regime other than what they believe and what their broader intentions are. This research is a step beyond the average. This is a deliberate attempt to move away from extrapolation. Rather than imposing our ideas and our best attempts at reasoning internally onto North Korea, this is an unimpeded, open access look inside North Korea itself. For today's podcast, a lot of this discussion will focus around a recent article that Meredith has published, titled "The Sun Sort of Rises, the Strong and Prosperous Slogan in Recent North Korean Fiction." And this is an interesting window into North Korean literature. The Strong and Prosperous Nation slogan is one that North Korea have held onto for quite a while. It centers around the year 2012, and the idea that North Korea by this date will become a strong, powerful, world-leading nation, incidentally to coincide with the 100-year anniversary of Kim Il-sung's birth. So when this date is mentioned internally to North Koreans, it is always married to ideas of infrastructure projects, of military building, of nation building, of an incredibly optimistic view on where North Korea is heading. But of course now that date has come and gone. So this offers another question and another interesting insight into the propaganda mechanism. That is, just how has the North Korean regime reinterpreted this idea since then? How has it managed expectations? And how has it moved ahead with the sloganeering and with these ideas despite the fact that North Korea has not fulfilled that grand ideal? What comes across in this new propaganda is a focus on color, on light, and on aesthetic beauty. A deliberate attempt to make the culture and the landscape look more attractive and more friendly. With this comes a focus on science and technology and the idea that North Korea is a modern nation with a new modern young leader, and therefore it belongs and is at the forefront of cutting-edge breakthroughs. With this is a changed focus on nature and on the environment. These are now aspects of daily life that have to be overcome, fought. They are described as tyrannies, and tyrannies that stand in the way of a happier, more comfortable future. A change in North Korean culture, where leisure time and recreation is just around the corner. The final theme in this, that which brings it all together, is a love and increasingly a faith in the regime. Not a broad, one-sided relationship, but also a forgiveness from leadership down. That is, all things can be forgiven, even political infractions and violations of law, if they are done so in good faith to the regime and with love to the broader nation. To get a real insight into the North Korean mind, you really have to go internally into this type of media, this type of internal messaging. And only from there you can grasp a real idea of North Korean ideology and how it is changing over time, and specifically now in the era of Kim Jong-un. Because it is also through this propaganda that the new cult of personality is being constructed, that his personality is being built and portrayed to his people. Now, the article from which much of the research for this podcast is taken is linked below, and I do encourage you to go and read it. But there is also a link below to Meredith Shaw's personal blog, focused on the translation and the analysis of North Korean literature. On this blog, you can find individual stories, snippets of North Korean literature that she has painstakingly translated and provided for public viewing. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account attached below, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. On that, and to walk us through the finer details of North Korean literature, this is Meredith Shaw. Meredith Shaw, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Thank you.
So today we're going to be speaking through, I suppose, the study of North Korean literature and in some ways the study of North Korean ideology. And I'm reading through, I suppose we're going to focus today's podcast largely around an article that you've written, but also about a much larger, broader aspect of research that you've been publishing, I suppose, over a few years now on your blog. So let's get into it, into the heart of this. Why is it important to study North Korean literature? Because I suppose for many people listening, they think this may be a parochial aspect, but it's something I'm very interested in, and I'm sure it's something that you have found quite, I suppose, a vital area to study and to understand the North Korean mindset. So why study North Korean literature per se?
Right. Well, literature is, to North Koreans, part of a broader program of the government controlling different areas of the arts. There are other scholars who focused on North Korean theater, North Korean films and TV. In general, first the question is why study the arts? And then the question is, why am I studying literature, I suppose. I think that the arts in general in North Korea provide a really interesting insight into how the regime tries to communicate with its people and what ideas over time the regime considers to be most important. Also how the regime communicates its history, the history of the founding of the country and Korean history to its people can provide a lot of clues. And why I focus on literature in particular, I suppose the fuzzy academic reason is that literature has a long-standing role in Korean society and Korean politics, both in North and South. And there's a great deal of respect for the written word. So I think it's an important area to focus on. And the personal reason is that it's just easier for me as a non-native speaker of Korean. It's difficult for me to understand things that are spoken with no subtitles, particularly North Korean. There are a lot of words and phrases that I don't quite catch, and I feel a lot more comfortable talking about literature because I can actually see the words on page and I can look them up if I don't know them. It's a great way to learn and familiarize yourself with North Korean styles of speaking. So for me personally, it's just more approachable.
And you mentioned there that it's important to study this because this is how North Koreans communicate with their people. So let's dig into a different aspect here, the idea of internal versus external propaganda, because
Right.
in many ways we are only touching on the external propaganda. And I take it the publication of internal literature is never intended for people like me or you to ever read.
That would have been true. I have said that in the past. I'm starting to revise that, actually. North Korean literature until recently was very difficult to obtain outside of the country. Recently, the regime has been putting more and more of its older literature online, so you can actually obtain famous novels. Some of the less political short stories are online. The main party literary magazine is still internal and doesn't seem to be distributed anywhere outside of the country. But stories that have been around for a while seem to be getting circulated and even sold online. So yes and no. But these stories are definitely directed at North Korean people internally. They're not something that the regime originally intends for outside non-Koreans to be reading.
And I suppose that's important because many people have this doubt, I suppose, as with the discussion these days about the next summit between Trump and Kim. There's a fear, I suppose, a very realistic understanding that what is being communicated outside of North Korea is not what's being communicated inside North Korea, I suppose. And that brings us to another question there. You have been involved in the study of literature, and I suppose you've written a few short stories yourself. So How do you study this North Korean literature in terms of literature? Is it possible to actually look at it as a literary device inside itself, or is it so state controlled that you've just got to look at it for its pure political and social message?
You can study it in terms of its literary quality, and in fact, there are several scholars over in the comparative literature area who've done some fantastic studies. Emmanuel Kim just came out with a book on North Korean literature, and I recommend that if anyone wants to look at more of the literary quality of it. I'm a political scientist, and I study this. Obviously, I'm very interested in the political messaging behind the stories more than the literary qualities of it. I think that North Koreans they have a long-standing appreciation of literature. They have a long literary tradition, and the writers of these stories draw from that tradition in terms of their for instance, their depictions of nature, their use of metaphorical language, things like that are true to what I would call historical Korean literary traditions. So you can analyze it in that respect. It's not just pure like a newspaper article propaganda, but the writers of these stories are under a tremendous amount of pressure and a tremendous amount of editing from the party. And as I talk about in my blog, there was a defector who had been part of this system, and he wrote a book very recently, Kim Jong-un, talking about his experience under the party's sort of writing bureaucracy, and how it's not even necessarily censorship the way we think of it, but it's more in order to get a story published in the first place, and in order to get praise from your editors, the writers know what they're supposed to be writing about and how they're supposed to be describing the regime and describing society, and they perform in that way. So there are certain expectations for how these stories are supposed to be written. And my mentor, Im Soon-hee, she's a South Korean expert in North Korean literature, and she's written about some of the rules that the writers have to follow in terms of how the leaders are described, and what aspects of the leaders are supposed to be emphasized. For instance, their facial expressions, their smile, the tone of their voice are always described the same way, and the leaders are always supposed to be described as optimistic. They're knowledgeable in all areas. They have a revolutionary spirit. There's a long list of qualities that writers are supposed to attribute to the leaders, and they follow this as a sort of blueprint for how they depict the leaders in the stories.
So that's a good introduction there. So let's jump into, I suppose, the core of this paper that you published, I suppose, December last year, about the recurring theme in new North Korean literature of the Strong and Prosperous Nation, this slogan. So what is this slogan? Take us first to the history of this slogan. Why is it important for North Korea? And what does it symbolize when it is first thought up in its historical context?
So Kangsong Daeguk is the slogan, strong, economically prosperous nation. And there are some variations of it, Kangsong Gukga, Kangsong Buhung. But this general phrase, Kangsong, in North Korea has been popping up for quite a while, in particular in relation to the strong and prosperous nation. This phrase started popping up in around 2000 or early 2000s, but really started appearing a lot in literature from 2006, 2007. Started seeing a lot of references to it. And it was sort of originally a catchphrase alluding to the year 2012, when North Korea would celebrate the 100th birthday of its first leader. If he had lived, he would have been 100 in 2012. And they were gearing up to get people excited about this year 2012, in which they declared that they would be a strong and prosperous nation. So this phrase appeared over and over again in the literature, in the state TV broadcasts, in big character posters at work sites, basically saying, everybody get excited about the strong and prosperous nation that we're about to achieve. Some people interpreted this in different ways. It seemed to be associated a lot at first with military strength and the idea that North Korea would achieve its nuclear and missile goals in that year, and from that year on, they wouldn't have to worry about the United States anymore. That they would be strong enough to defend against any external threat, so they could just go ahead and enjoy kind of the fruits of socialist prosperity. And also in the same year, they had hoped to complete a number of important infrastructure projects in terms of energy production and getting the factories back working and reaching certain economic targets to restart the distribution system and get back to more of a regular economy. So originally, that was what the phrase was meant to inspire people to think, in terms of get ready for the year 2012. This year is going to be a real great year for our country. It's going to be the year that everything changes, basically.
And I suppose an important thing there, and something that comes across through your writing here, is this strange dichotomy between this claim that in 2012 they would become a strong and prosperous nation, and I suppose the very obvious understanding that they haven't become a strong and prosperous nation. But as you mentioned here, there's been a type of reinterpretation, if that's even the right way to say it, that before 2012, it was always spoken about how we would become great at this time. And I suppose in very good very good politician terms, they simply started saying that they have achieved a strong and prosperous nation. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, well, the change occurred somewhat gradually, so it wasn't, there is a certain amount of fudging, I think, that you can ascribe to the way that it changed. But as everyone knows, at the dawn of 2012, North Korea very suddenly had a new leader, and a lot of things over time in the internal propaganda started to evolve to reflect the reality under the new leader and his changing priorities. So this phrase kind of evolved in the same way to reflect the new leader's priorities. And the things that the new leader was achieving were not necessarily things that his father, the previous leader, had anticipated as the signs of prosperity and strength.
So let's move on to those changes then. So one of the things that seems to come through with the new leader, and since 2012, is a focus on making things brighter and more colorful and more friendly, and I suppose making things just more aesthetically pleasing. And this comes along through, I suppose, a number of things, but also just simply the skyscraper of Pyongyang. So I might get you to take us there and this focus on this aesthetic beauty inside North Korean literature and in the reality outside, I suppose, as well.
Right. So this is something that you really feel when you read the stories that have come out recently, is the North Koreans' association of light with prosperity and light with achievement, and having a bright city, having bright lights, having warm, regular supply of electricity. And so these stories, a lot of them now are alluding to the new buildings that you mentioned in Pyongyang that are going up, that have gone up in recent years. The regime put a lot of effort into building a number of impressive-looking high-rise apartment buildings and high-rise complexes in the capital, using more modern methods of architecture than what we traditionally associate with the North Korean capital is a very Soviet-era kind of architecture. So they've put in some buildings that at night when they're lit up, they kind of make a person think of a small but growing Asian metropolis, perhaps. Some of them have sort of spacey curves to them, so they look a little bit more modern. And the stories will allude to these buildings. There's one story where a family gets an apartment in one of the buildings, and they're so impressed because they have all these facilities in the complex, and they're right in the middle of the most exciting part of Pyongyang. So story basically is about this regular family getting an apartment in this new complex, and the story itself seems like a way to showcase some of the things that the regime is building. So that's a good example. It's not just buildings, though. There's another story that talks about the fireworks displays that have always been a part of major North Korean anniversaries, like the leader's birthday and the anniversary of the end of the war have always had a big fireworks show. But in recent years, these have gotten a lot more professionalized. And I can remember even before Kim Jong-un was the leader, one of the first things that the regime sort of advertised as him being in charge of was one of these fireworks shows. So they made an effort. Perhaps it was his idea, there's no way to know, but they decided that this fireworks show was going to be a lot bigger and brighter, and then associate that with the name of Kim Jong-un. So this one story by a very famous North Korean writer, that the story title is A Promise of Fire, talks about Kim Jong-un planning this fireworks display and trying to figure out the technique of getting this new kind of firework to work. And he's shown as being kind of a techie and really detail oriented. But of course, the fireworks show is a huge success, and his father gets to see it before it was. The story is set before his father passed away, even though it was written after. So his father congratulates him on this fantastic fireworks show. And the two leaders together talk about how important light is to their people after the darkness of the famine. So this is something that is being touched on more and more, is that the famine period was really difficult for North Korea in terms of obviously lack of food, but also darkness and coldness because of the lack of electricity. So this story alludes to the fireworks show being so bright and being a sign that the future is going to be bright, and it's going to be better than in the past when people were living in darkness.
And I suppose you've touched on something there that, as you say as well, comes through in a lot of this reading of modern Korean literature. This idea of the change in way, I suppose is the first real public conception of Kim Jong-un. And as you say, he comes through in 2012 when he takes power. And they are in many ways building him up through literature in a very different way to which they built up his father. So Kim Jong Il was a patron of the arts. He studied. He was always having these great new inventions, I suppose, in film and movies, etc. But you talk about throughout modern Korean literature how they're focusing Kim Jong-un, I suppose, as a young leader, and part of this has got to do with him being tech savvy in many ways.
Yeah, so I suppose it's predictable that the regime would attribute a younger leader to being more tech savvy than his father, but it also, some analysts have suspected that this reflects a broader regime drive to get more young people and more resources steered towards technology than were in the past. And it's really striking in retrospect that Kim Jong Il didn't have the same attributes associated with him when he first came in. He was a fairly young leader when his name started being mentioned in the 80s. But he was always very interested in movies and communicating with people through the arts and in theater, musical theater, and that was where he put most of his energy. So the kind of celebrity job in North Korea during the Kim Jong Il era would have been to be in the arts in some way. And now the regime seems to be much more focused on making celebrities out of people who have achieved things in the sciences. So that in the stories they will depict, they'll never depict any actual person by name, but they'll depict someone making a revolutionary discovery about fertilizer, how to make fertilizer work better, or making a discovery about how to grow a certain kind of tree that will rapidly repopulate the forests of North Korea that have been depleted. So you see a lot of stories depicting the scientists struggling with their ideas. And then Kim Jong-un's character will come in at the critical moments. And when the scientist is struggling and can't figure something out, Kim Jong-un will come in and say, oh, this is how I have found this technique to be helpful, or I've done some reading on my own and I figured out your problem for you. And Kim Jong-un will sort of guide them towards making the discovery. So they make this discovery on their own eventually, but it's implied that Kim Jong-un sort of already knew the solution and wanted his people to figure it out on their own.
I suppose that's an important aspect of North Korean internal ideology there, that the leader is not, I suppose, an all-knowing God that many people outside the country look at him as, but internally he is understood in many ways, I suppose, as a parent or a mother figure or a father figure that comes in and gives encouragement to people with problems, and then they automatically soon enough find that they had the solution inside them all along.
Yeah, and it's really interesting the way they depict this kind of leadership, that they don't want him to come in and solve things for people, but they can't really have a resolution that doesn't involve him in some way in these stories. So in literature we have the term Deus ex machina. The God swoops in and solves the problem for people. In North Korea, the God swooping in is always the leader, and he comes in as a guide and someone who always seems pretty confident that the person he's working with is gonna figure it out, but he needs a lot of pushing in the right direction. So you get the sense that the leader is watching all of these experts in their fields, and he's keeping a very close eye on what they're doing and making sure that they figure it out eventually. But he's not doing the work for them. He's letting them figure it out. So he's a very good teacher, very good guide, as you said, kind of like a parental figure, hoping that his people will follow in his footsteps and figure things out.
And on the other side of that is, I suppose, if that's the way that they're building Kim Jong-un up as the parent leader, on the other side of that, it comes through some, I suppose we touched on a little bit there when we spoke about the idea of beautifying the skyline and making it a pretty city. But some of the other themes that you say that comes through in this literature is the words like colorful and childish and dreamlike and Fantasyland. And in many ways, it sounds as though they are not just building Kim Jong-un up to be a parental leader, but also encouraging the population to look at themselves as children in many ways, or childlike, as impulsive and I suppose striving for aesthetic beauty in many ways, but also just inside striving for the joy in life. And it's the parent will take care of everything, and you just embrace your inner self.
Right, and this has been noticed by other people who've visited the capital or visited other parts of North Korea since the new leader took over, is that things are have a kind of new color scheme to them. There are a lot of more pastels, a lot more color, unusual colors to buildings, and you'll see slogans that refer to a socialist fairyland, or building a socialist fairyland. The North Korean regime has always emphasized itself as a paradise for children, and there are a lot of slogans associated with the children are the kings of our and queens of our country and things like that. So it's not exactly new, but it definitely seems that in terms of aesthetics, where the regime has put a lot of its efforts in recent years, they're trying to make things look more colorful and brighter and more and put in more facilities that you would associate with childhood. They renovated a beach resort that they've had for a while as a youth camp. They've really been promoting that as a place where all the children of the world can come and enjoy North Korea. And as you've probably seen, they have a number of amusement parks that they've built in recent years that are being promoted in the capital, a water park and kind of a modern style roller coasters, and also a dolphinarium. And these facilities are emphasized as a way that regular workers and regular people can come to the capital on a special day and have a break from their work and really enjoy the benefits that socialism has to offer in a way that maybe in the West only rich people would be able to go to things like this. So they're providing entertainments for people, but they're providing the sort of entertainment that I would associate more with teenagers or children. But in North Korea today, these facilities are getting the most attention, it seems.
And another fascinating aspect of that focus on parenthood and childhood is also the way they're depicting Kim Jong-un as, I suppose, a more vulnerable leader than his father or certainly his grandfather ever was. Through a lot of this writing that you've put into this article here and through your blog, it seems as though Kim Jong-un is challenged in many things that he is going through. It's not like he is certain of himself. In many ways, in some of these articles and some of this writing, he is speaking internally or sometimes outright to his dead father and saying things like, I hope I'm living up to your message, or please give me guidance. It's almost like they're validating him, choosing to validate the son through the father as well.
Right. So there are a few moments that are really striking in the stories, in the recent stories, where they show Kim Jong-un mourning his father. And one story in particular has him, he keeps picking up the phone whenever he has some piece of good news, thinking, oh, I've got to tell my father, and then realizing that his father is dead. And I suppose it's something a lot of people can relate with if they've lost a loved one, the need to the constant feeling like, oh, I have to tell him this, and then he's gone. There's another story where he sees some flowers that remind him of his mother's favorite flower, and he decides to pluck a sprig of this flower and keep it with him. And throughout the story, he talks to the flower as if it were his mother. And there's another story where he that shows him kind of going through the process of the funeral for his father, and he's constantly being presented with different officials coming to him with things for him to sign, saying, we're sorry to bother you while you're mourning, but your father always absolutely insisted on handling this stuff himself personally, and so we need your signature. And he's realizing for the first time just how much work his father did and how much he was invested in the life of the people. So this has been a really recurrent theme in the first 2 or 3 years, especially after Kim Jong Il died, showing Kim Jong-un either having a memory of his father overworking, working too hard, or being suddenly realizing for the first time just how much his father cared about the people. I think it's, as you said, it's a way of showing how he is still, his father's still living on through the son, and the son is trying to live up to the burdens of the father. And it also serves a purpose in North Korean literature of sort of retroactively explaining how it is that the leader passed away. So when Kim Jong Il was alive in fiction, he would never have been described as weak in any way. And he was always up until the very end, the leader is described as being extremely energetic and just having limitless energy and power and being seeming like someone who would live forever. And then you have a leader who dies, and you have to explain, well, how could that be when the leader is so invincible? So these newer stories will show scenes of Kim Jong-un walking in on his father and seeing him kind of slumped over his desk or having some kind of pain, and then shaking it off and saying it's nothing. And you have a lot of scenes that imply that Kim Jong-il was actually very sick, but he was hiding it because he didn't want people to worry. So not only are they explaining how it is that the leaders became mortal and died, but they're implying that people have a responsibility to the leader to keep him healthy and keep him strong by not burdening him with too much work. That the leader is always going to try to overwork himself. So the people around him need to be more careful and need to try to do more, make more of an effort to get the country to assure the leader that the country is in good hands. So the message I see there is, be good to your leader. Your leader will always do everything he can for you, and it's your responsibility to show him that you're living the good life and that you can do these things on your own. So it's sort of a big guilt trip on people when the leader dies.
It sounds as though it sounds as though it's this idea that he is so self-sacrificing, therefore you must be just as self-sacrificing all the time. I can see how you sort of burden the country with the death of the leader who tried so hard worked so hard before he died. But there is another theme that does come through, and you mentioned earlier this idea of this fireworks display in this story, how Kim Jong-un comes in and he creates a brand new fireworks display that impresses his father. But in the fireworks display, Kim Jong-un says, this artillery salute is our way of showing the world the reality of our strong and prosperous nation. So I'm wondering here how clear is the message internally about military strength? Is it always a subversive kind of message, as in our fireworks display can learn things from our military apparatus, or is there a more overt message coming through as well? How is it being displayed internally as opposed to how we see it externally?
Right. The fiction and the literature and other internal arts don't talk about what we would think of as military themes nearly as much. There are some stories that talk about triumphs in satellite technology, which we always understand to be missile technology. But in the stories themselves, they never talk about, we're launching a missile to scare the foreign powers. It's always, the story always talks about how this is a scientific achievement. We're putting a satellite into space that's going to broadcast patriotic songs for the whole world to hear. And so in that respect, the stories don't allude to any sort of preparations for attack or war, but there are a lot of other ways that military language comes through in the text, in different places where people are deployed for speed battles, for construction battles, or for flood relief. The effort is always described in very militaristic terms. So when they're talking about people building a dam, they'll say, we're going to the front lines of the battle for economic prosperity. Or when they're going to a place that's been hit by really bad flooding, and sometimes the regime always sends military units to help rebuild after the flood, and they'll say we're going to the point of battle, or we're going to war with the tyranny of nature. Is showing how even though the country is not in a conventional war at the moment, the military is constantly battling with these other forces, these economic problems, and problems with infrastructure and problems with nature, and the environmental destruction in the country is seen as a different kind of war. So there's this very martial language that's used to describe very more conventional forms of economic development. The line between economic efforts and military efforts becomes blurred.
So let's talk about that war on nature and this idea of the tyranny of nature. So this is in some ways a new theme, it seems, that is coming up, and in some ways it seems to have broken I suppose it's not a taboo as such, as it was never the idea of the famine in the mid-1990s was something that was banned. It was silenced at the time. I did a podcast with Sandra Fahy a while ago, and she spoke about how the language at the time, they had to use euphemisms for everything they said about the famine. But since which, in some ways, it's been increasingly recognized that there was this hardship. It's not something you can silence down too much. But in some of this more recent literature, they speak in increasing ways about that period. If not explicitly, they make mentions to a difficult period. And a lot of what they're talking about in this war against nature is building dams and things like this. And of course, massive flooding was one of the great problems that contributed to the famine. So I might get to introduce that idea, this fight against nature and this increasing focus on the famine.
Right. I wouldn't say it's a completely new idea, because I think issues with flooding and issues with nature have appeared in writing and fiction for some time, but it's become much more prevalent, and many more stories talking about the deforestation problem in particular. The lack of trees is an indirect way of referencing the famine, because during the famine, people had to struggle to find ways to heat their homes. The state distribution, in addition to food, the state was no longer distributing coal. And so a lot of people went into the hills and cut down trees. And then as a result, the hillsides became prone to erosion, which caused a lot of problems in addition to property destruction. It caused a lot of problems for the soil. So these problems have sort of steamrolled as, there are no trees left to burn, and that also damages the fertility of the soil. A lot of stories now are dealing with people trying to find ways to grow trees or to preserve trees, and also finding ways to improve soil fertility, which some of the stories refer overtly to the fact that people cut down these trees in the famine. They'll refer to them as selfish people who were selling the wood to make money for themselves. They won't refer to them as poor people who got cut off from government supply. But there is an increasing reference to the fact that some of these environmental problems stem from the famine period, the arduous march period, as it's called in North Korean literature. So they're able to make these references to the famine now because it's in the past. And obviously people remember it, and they can have this triumphant narrative that we've lived through the arduous march thanks to our leaders' help, and now that period is behind us and the future is bright. So it's interesting that in retrospect they're able to refer to the hardship of the past, and also the way that people overcame that hardship as something that the new generation going forward has to honor by working hard to make sure that that never happens again.
And one of the themes there that you mentioned here as well is the idea of love and faith. And this seems to take on a very new element here. As we mentioned before, the idea that North Koreans see in their leaders as motherly figures or parental figures is not a new thing. This has been done, I suppose, through the years, and other people have mentioned this before. But there seems to be a new trend here that it's not just that people should, that the North Korean leaders should look on their people as children, but they should also have those children have a certain amount of faith in them, and that faith should be, I suppose, reciprocal in a way, but also there's a lot of forgiveness in this as well. So there's some strange ideas that seem to come through that sort of bounce against the outside understanding of a totalitarian regime. So there's these claims, I suppose, through a few stories of people in some ways they I suppose they're misappropriating funds, or they're doing the wrong things, and Kim Jong-un is coming in, and instead of reprimanding them, he's in some ways giving them extra and saying it's actually a good thing that what they've done. They have expressed a certain amount of faith and a care for the people around them, and it was only natural that they should behave this way. And there's a story here where Kim Jong-un talks to a grandfather who was a botanist who was complaining about his grandson, and Kim Jong-un says, "It's good to misbehave. The new generation must be bold and gutsy enough in their hope and ideals to conquer and rule the world." So this is almost a forgiveness of unruly behavior and a forgiveness of mistakes and things like this.
Right. If the mistake is made in service of the people and in service of the party, or if the mistake reflects a faith that the party is doing the right thing, then it can be forgiven. So the characters in the stories that make these mistakes, one of the, I guess, popular story arcs in these stories that I'm reading is a character will be introduced as having done something horrible, that you think, oh, how could he ever be forgiven for that? And then the backstory will sort of explain the circumstances, and by the end you feel sympathetic to the guy, but then the leader comes in and offers forgiveness. Like there's another story that I read recently where some military unit is building a dam, and they end up taking this woman's nearby old woman's pig and slaughtering it and eating it. And so the party officials hear the story and they think this is terrible. There's not only are they taking an old woman's pig, but the problem of the military sort of feeding off of the people is something that the regime has worried about for quite some time. So this seems to be illustrating that. And then you find out that actually the old woman was her grandson is a part of the military unit, and he saw that his fellows were starving, and so he took his this pig that his grandmother had been raising for his wedding and gave it to his unit. And so you hear the back circumstances, and then the person becomes a sympathetic character, and then the party can forgive. Actually, Kim Jong-un didn't appear in that story, but this is a common story arc of people doing things that seem bad, and then but it turns out that what they were doing was in service of the party's goals and in service of the country, and in that case, it can be forgiven. And then another related theme is this idea of kindness or friendliness that seems to be associated with Kim Jong-un's new era, that people need to be kinder in their attitude towards serving the people, and it's not just about kind of slavishly doing your job. You should put a little bit of friendliness into your work. So this seems to be a theme of giving people a little bit more slack and trying to get people to be a kinder, friendlier nation, I suppose.
And part of that kinder and friendlier idea is a renewed focus on Pyongyang. I suppose this one is a very new change in North Korean literature, at least from my reading. It used to focus a lot on a glorification of the countryside, people being encouraged to go back to their hometowns. And a lot of the movies and literature used to focus on people returning to their countryside and then rediscovering who they were and what it is to be North Korean, etc. But a lot of the more modern literature focuses around, of course, Kim Jong-un, and through that, the capital city, Pyongyang. And it's not just an abstract setting, it's things like Kim Jong-un navigating his way through the streets and driving around, and they're really building in that Kim Jong-un is a Pyongyang native, and that the center of the modern North Korean literary life is focused on Pyongyang.
Right. So there have been stories focused on the capital for a long time, but it hasn't been nearly as frequent in the past to show characters inhabiting the city and looking up and appreciating the skyline and noticing this new hospital that's just been built, and or this new spa facility, and taking pride in the achievements in the capital. There's definitely an image of the capital in North Korea, and we hear this in the reporting in the West as well, that the capital is where the regime puts all of its money and all of its resources, and if you tour North Korea, they're going to just show you the capital and not the countryside. This has been a complaint for many years by foreign visitors, and of course the capital has always been the showcase. But what that means internally is that to live in the capital is a very big privilege, and people are always trying to find some way to get a job or a work permit that can take them to the capital. So I felt that in the past the literature kind of didn't want to rub that in people's faces quite too much, that everything great is happening in the capital, so that there were stories talking more about people in the countryside enjoying their pastoral rural life thanks to the party, and having these traditional folk celebrations and things that maybe in the capitalist South people have forgotten about, but in the North are still protected. So it seemed like some of the older fiction made an effort to encourage people to think that the life in the country isn't all that bad. But definitely newer stories, perhaps not by design, but just inevitably due to the pressure to highlight some of these new facilities in the capital. The newer stories are increasingly showing characters living the good life in the capital and enjoying the fruits of the things that have been developed in the capital for the people's enjoyment, like the amusement park and the dolphin show, things like that maybe people in the countryside wouldn't often be able to see or have access to.
So that last point there, it sounds to me, and I suppose people listening, that it could be a potentially dangerous thing for the Kim regime to do. The idea that you sell to the people just how good things are and how much recreational time and how much fun we can have, when many people are not having it. So I begin to wonder, how do you think that this message, or why this message is being sent out? Is it a message in some ways about the South, as in, of course, for a long time, North Koreans have known that South Korea is a more wealthy country. They have their other, of course, they tinge that with understanding that, yes, but they are American puppets, but they are more wealthy. So is it a claim that we are now just as wealthy and have just as much privilege as they do in the South, and therefore a reunification is much closer? Or is it something aspirational that they are being sold to the people in the countryside as this is something that if you work hard you can achieve? Or I did read at some point throughout this that I got this understanding that it was being sold as look how good the regime is to you. That in many other places in the world, the things being given to you as a people by us is so elaborate that even if the South is more rich, only the absolute rich in the South or other countries can afford it. And this is a socialist paradise, and therefore we are giving you this benefit.
Right. I always hesitate to speculate too much about the motives behind the changes that I see in the literature, because obviously I don't have access to the people who are writing this to get their motivations, or I don't have access to the internal party directives on messaging. So it's difficult for me to speculate exactly what they're thinking, and I always have to take a little grain of salt because I know that I'm attributing my own ideas to some of these stories. But there seems to be, there's a genuine pride in the new form of the capital, and it took a tremendous amount of labor, obviously, to build these facilities, and so there's a genuine need, I think, to take pride in what they've been able to build in the last few years. It's difficult probably for the regime to avoid talking about that in the form of the arts and literature. And it's hard to keep writing stories about the same old when you have this really bright new entertainment complex that you want to show off. So I can understand that motivation. There is definitely a note, and it comes through more obviously in the nonfiction kind of straight up propaganda writing that you see in North Korean newspapers, that people in capitalist countries would never be able to enjoy such a wonderful, bright city with so many entertainments unless they had a lot of money. And in capitalist countries, the poor have to kind of watch in silence as the rich people enjoy going to the dolphinarium or going to the ski resort. And, a normal worker would never be able to enjoy those sorts of things. So you should be glad to be living in this capitalist society and enjoy the things that the party has provided for you.
And you mentioned at the very start of this podcast, but as we've been speaking, it's been pinging again in my mind through almost everything that we've been speaking about. And that seems to be a complete running theme through almost all of these stories and everything that we've been speaking about of optimism. And you see this, of course, in a lot of phrases and a lot of terminology that comes through, like there is a new dawn and the sunrise and green shoots and things like this coming up. This idea that things may not feel perfect right now, but it is a completely optimistic message, and I suppose in some ways a claim that despite everything, we shouldn't be fearful of change, that even if the people around them don't see this prosperous nation that they claim, that it is just there, it is right on them, and it is optimism that's going to take them there.
Mm. Yeah, and even if people don't see it, I think the idea is that people can see the prosperous nation, but what they're pointing at as a sign of the prosperous nation is the color and the brightness of the buildings, and they're saying don't look at whether the water is working inside those buildings, but look at or don't look at whether the factories are running. Look at this bright, happy island that we've created where there's an amusement park, and or look at the new children's hospital and how modern it looks, and so it does seem to be that they're actually trying to have very visual signs of prosperity as opposed to more concrete things that people can feel. But they're definitely pointing at the things that the regime has decided to put its energies into since Kim Jong-un became the leader, and saying these are the ultimate signs of prosperity that you were always hoping for.
And as a final question here, there is something that seems to come through much of this, that despite all the optimism, there is a certain risk that the North Korean regime is taking. And I suppose in some ways it's a new risk that they haven't often taken in the past. That is by focusing so much on recreation and fun and enjoyment and how pretty and nice the Pyongyang is, and dolphinariums and theme parks. They are potentially creating an idea in the mind of North Koreans of rising expectations. and then those expectations falling short, but people still having that picture in their mind of what is being expected there. Now, this is a risk in any country, the idea of massive inequality, and of course the idea of expectations not being fulfilled. But do you see this as becoming a risk, as in something that, so through the reading of the literature, do you think they are sleepwalking into this in a way, or do you think there is something they're incredibly conscious of and they are managing it subtly through the literature?
I would say if I can just give purely my instinct, which is informed, I suppose, by what I've seen in recent years, I think that the new leadership has less fear of the people than the old leadership did, and I think that they are a bit more confident that they can keep this level of optimism up. So they don't seem to be too concerned about getting people excited about the future and getting people excited about new trends, and also encouraging innovative thinking and, as I mentioned earlier, somewhat rebellious thinking. I think all of these things point to a propaganda apparatus that is entering its eighth decade now. Getting close to its eighth decade. That is very confident that what it's doing has infinite power to drive people forward, to make people optimistic about the future. And it will bear some watching, because for the last 10 years, the regime has had a lot of good stories to tell its people and things to get people excited about. And certainly last year with the summits with the South Korean president and with the American president, there was a tremendous amount of excitement that was palpable in the internal propaganda. It hasn't been written about in fiction yet. Fiction usually takes a couple of years to catch up with what's happening in the present day. But I was surprised by how much the internal regime newscasts and broadcasts were really, really prompt in encouraging people to think that this was all a very good sign, that peace deal is imminent, and that that things are going to get a lot better, particularly after the meeting with the South Korean leader. I was surprised by how unvarnished positive outlook the media reports gave to that. So I see in general a propaganda apparatus that's coming into trying to be more of a 21st century news machine, trying to reflect some of the more modern, kind of shinier aspects of media that they've seen in Chinese media. And it will be really interesting to see if they can keep that up. And when the first bit of really bad news happens, how are they going to temper expectations, particularly if the American president doesn't continue to have this charm offensive with North Korea. It seems like a situation that could turn sour very suddenly. And the propaganda has already sort of committed to the idea that these summits are a good thing and a positive thing. So, of course, they can always reverse that, and they have the power to kind of pretend that the past didn't happen. But it seems like they're taking some risks and encouraging people to think of what's happening right now as a sign of good things to come.
So that's a good look into the future and a good place to leave the podcast on, I suppose. The article that we've been speaking through today, of course, we've been picking up different passages from it, but it is entitled "The Sun Sort of Rises, the Strong and Prosperous Slogan in Recent North Korean Fiction." I'll provide a link below, but also much more of Meredith's work can be found online through her blog, which is dprklit.blogspot.com. And once again, the link will be there below this podcast. So I encourage people to go and look at both those links there. So Meredith Shaw, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you very much.